Alrighty. And we'll close out of that. I could not. Okay, that's fine. Alrighty. So now we are actually in business. Yeah. So same reminders apply in terms of screens down. We're taking notes ideally by hand, unless you need to reference the text and it's virtual, then that's fine. And just in terms of the text, before we get into it, I mean, you'll see where I'm taking things in a second. Yeah, if there are points where we directly reference the text or like read any quotes directly, obviously the N-word comes up throughout. So I'm just asking that we do not say the word. If there's a passage that needs to be read aloud on my part, or if any of you would like to bring a passage to the class in a response, you would just kind of redact it and say the N-word instead. So that all clear? Okay, so with that being said, let's get to our keywords. So yeah, as usual, go ahead and write these down in your notes. And oh yeah, I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. And they will be interwoven throughout our discussion today. Right, everyone all set? 30 more seconds. Alrighty, so first keyword, thought it was appropriate, obviously, to have the author of our novel this week, Zora Neale Hurston, as the first keyword. And yeah, I think what I want to do to kind of get us started is giving us a little more background on Hurston. I know Professor Barnes gave us some in her previous lecture from last week, I believe it was last Tuesday. So you've seen her picture and gotten a little bit of background of where she kind of fits in Harlem Renaissance literature and whatnot. But I want to, if you have your version of the book, feel free to pull it out. If not, no worries, I'll read aloud. But at the end of the book, we get kind of a chronology, and we'll talk about legacy, but this is definitely a reprinting of the book. So this is not, wasn't always present in earlier copies, but in a more recent version, this is at the very end, we kind of get a chronology of Hurston's life. Sometimes she would lie about her age or kind of, tell stories about when she was born. But this chronology sticks to she was born in 1891. Sometimes she would say she was born like right at the beginning of the 20th century. So, we can follow the chronology. It's not something we have to be super precise about. But yeah, I think it's just a few points from Hurston's life that I think are useful to point out are specifically, she's born in the South, we see, in Alabama. This chronology actually doesn't include that she does spend some of her childhood in Eatonville, Florida, which is the town that is location for a lot of the novel. So Eatonville is a real place. And she does spend some time there as well. She's not born there, but she spends time there. And so that's obviously impacting her view on the world, her view on historically Black towns, which we'll talk more about. Yeah. And she also attends Howard University, which is a historically Black college and university. So she gets her associate degree in 1920. I think that's worth noting, just in terms of thinking about some of her coming of age journey being in a historically Black town, some of her earlier education being done in a historically Black institution. We can talk more about that later. And so then later on, 1925 to 27, she attends Barnard College. She's studying anthropology with Franz Boas. He's a really famous anthropologist who is giving her this training that she then takes and is going down south and abroad as well. But she's traveling and kind of doing this folklore history and research. And some of this her knowledge of folklore is personal from her childhood and upbringing, but some of it she's also kind of learning as she kind of starts out on what you could really argue is an academic career. When she starts working with Boas. So yeah, we see in 1927, she goes to Florida to collect folklore, different parts of Florida. She publishes about a Black settlement at St. Augustine and later that year. In December of 1927, they note that Hurston signs a contract with Mason. I believe the person's first name is Charlotte Mason. Have to double check that. But the entry says it enables her to return to the South to collect folklore. So what do you think that is signaling? Like, what is Mason's role based off of this information in Hurston's life or career? Just a guess. Throw it out. So Mason, the person signs a contract in December of 1927 with Mason, and the biography entry at the end of the book says that this contract that she signs enables her to return to the South to collect folklore. So what do we make of that? Because it's obviously a very brief snippet at a point in her history, but folks like Mason are important figures, especially when we're thinking about Black 20th century writers, Harlem Renaissance writers, folks like Langston Hughes, who Zora is also in conversation with. But so what does that mean? Yeah. Yes. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. So Mason, is a wealthy white benefactor in the North who supports Hurston, I believe Hughes, other Black writers around this Harlem Renaissance time. And her funding allows Hurston to continue the work that she's going on to do. So there's a lot of kind of writings, critiques about, the pros and cons of having a figure like Mason. But I think it's just important to note for sure, especially as we get into thinking about the folk and just kind of certain resistances that Hurston enacts in the way she's writing, who she's writing for, and whatnot. And so, just wanted to point that out. 1934, she goes to Bethune-Cookman College to establish a School of Dramatic Arts based on pure Negro expression. So Bethune-Cookman is another HBCU. The term Negro expression is something that'll come up a little later in our discussion today. So that's something that Hurston is definitely really, really interested in. She's a novelist, so she's writing fiction, but she's also writing essays and kind of theorizing what, in her view, Black Southern life can look like when it's articulated in a way that kind of takes up the folk, or like it's articulated through folk tales. So, and then we finally get to 1937, when Hurston writes, "Their eyes are watching God in 7 weeks in Haiti." So that, I think that's just always mind blowing to me when I see that, because it's not a lot of time to write a novel. And then, she returns to the US later in September of that year, and it is published. And so, the biography goes on to other points of her life, but I think the point that we will fast forward to is the end of her life and kind of the end of her life, her legacy, and kind of how the importance of those things. So before I get to what's on the screen, we see after, even though Hurston continues to publish different things, novels and short stories, she later in her life, she struggles to earn a living to sustain herself off of just being a writer, which is not uncommon even to this day. And so in 1956, she's working as a librarian, excuse me. She's working as a substitute teacher. She suffers a stroke in 1959. And the next year, she dies in 1960 in a welfare home of hypertensive heart disease. And she doesn't have a lot of money at the time. It doesn't seem she has much family. And so she's buried in an unmarked grave in Florida. And so that's 1960. It's it's a kind of a grim ending. But then 13 years later, Alice Walker, who we have up here, who's a celebrated African-American novelist and writer. She's best known for her novel, The Color Purple, some of you may be familiar with. Walker is still engaging, Walker and other folks, but are engaging with Hurston's work, and Walker specifically seeks out Hurston's unmarked grave. She's going to Eatonville and areas around it, and she's kind of questioning, like, why aren't we hearing more about Hurston? Like, we have this novel, which got some acclaim when it came out, also faced some criticism, which we'll talk about, but for overall, it was kind of underread. It wasn't, it didn't have this kind of resurgence that we've seen now, where it's being reprinted, where a film later comes about, and all these things. In some ways, I think people kind of argue like Hurston was maybe before her time. Like her peers didn't quite know what to do with her, and there are a lot of reasons for why literary works don't always see success. But so this bothers Alice Walker, and she decides to do something about it. And so she seeks out Hurston's grave. She talks about it in this collection of hers, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, and specifically in a essay called Looking for Zora, which I'll come back to in a second. So she teams up with a researcher who's also thinking about Hurston's legacy, and they find Hurston's unmarked grave, and Walker buys a tombstone and makes sure that it marks the grave. And so it's kind of small. You probably can't see it very well, but now Hurston's tombstone, thanks to Walker, reads Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South, born in 1901, passed in 1960, novelist, folklorist, anthropologist. So what comes to mind when you kind of just hear that snippet of the history of Hurston's legacy, and even just seeing the tombstone, and like what's kind of at play here, do you think? Yeah. Oh, Mason. That's a good question. I'm honestly not sure of like the inner workings of that contract. I would assume like there was some, if she's like seen as an investor, there's some return on her investment. But yeah, I'm not totally sure of the inner workings of that. That's definitely something I can look into. But but overall, like we know, but yeah, Their Eyes Were Watching God when it was first published, and in the early years after, it did not receive the level of acclaim that it has today. But what do we make of Walker's move to mark Hurston's grave? And
Yeah, I mean, like, the fact that anthropologist is also included on there is interesting. I feel like I think Walker definitely moved towards trying to memorialize Hurston as like not only like a great writer, which I feel like is of course immediate thought when you think of Zora Neale Hurston, but also as like a big contributor to like understanding African American culture, or like Southern culture. So I feel like that was just interesting.
Yeah, for sure. The titles that were selected to be put on it, definitely kind of gesturing towards her view as public figure, and yeah, her contributions to African American history, cultural history, Black Southern history, particularly. So yeah, it's definitely notable that Walker puts on this tombstone, genius of the South, and then also make sure that she's memorialized with those titles, especially because elsewhere in the chronology of her life, it's noted that she does, when she's at Columbia with Boaz, try to pursue a PhD in anthropology and is not successful in that attempt. So by academic standards, she wouldn't necessarily be a scholar. She's not lettered in the sense where she completed her PhD. So I think you can also read the move as Walker saying, well, okay, person is obviously still very well educated, but it's like, okay, well, she didn't get this final advanced degree, but she still has done her due diligence as a novelist and as a cultural critic, as we're going to see in some of the essays that we'll discuss a little later. So yeah, I think that's important for sure to just kind of point out. I recommend that you all take a look at the essay Looking for Zora on your own time. It's really beautiful. And yeah, we don't have time to go through all of it today. But I think a couple of notable things from it is just the beginning. Walker includes an epigraph from a scholar, Robert Hemingway, who, not the novelist Hemingway, but Hemingway, he's a scholar. He writes in an anthology about Hurston, and I quote, Zora Neale Hurston is one of the most significant unread authors in America, the author of 2 minor classics and 4 other major books. And so that's kind of the epigraph. That's the last, that quote kicks off then Walker's essay talking about her journey to literally finding Hurston's unmarked grave, which is not easy to do because it is unmarked. And she died, a poor Black woman in the South. Yeah, and it gets into all the things, the intricacies of that. And so there was one other part I did want to include, though, about the essay. So Walker ends the essay, it's like the second to last paragraph, by writing, and I quote, there are times, and finding Zora Hurston's grave was one of them, when normal responses of grief, horror, and so on do not make sense because they bear no real relation to the depth of the emotion one feels. It was impossible for me to cry when I saw the field full of weeds where Zora is. Partly this is because I have come to know Zora through her books, and she was not a teary sort of person herself, but partly too, it is because there is a point at which even grief feels absurd. And at this point, laughter gushes up to retrieve sanity. Any responses to that passage? Anything kind of stand out? Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I'm sorry for not having on the screen. I was trying to keep the slides for being too wordy. But yes, I'm happy to read it one more time. So Walker writes, There are times, and finding Zora Hurston's grave was one of them, when normal responses of grief, horror, and so on do not make sense because they bear no real relation to the depth of the emotion one feels. It is impossible for me to cry. It was impossible for me to cry when I saw the field full of weeds where Zora is. Partly this is because I have come to know Zora through her books, and she was not a teary sort of person herself, but partly too, it is because there is a point at which grief feels absurd. And at this point, laughter gushes up to retrieve sanity.
This is just like kind of connected. Like when you were listening to that about like the depth of feeling, the depth of thought, it made me think of a quote that I picked out from the book, which is there's a basin in the mind where words float around. This is like in chapter 2, I think. It's page 24.
Okay.
There's a basin in the mind where words float around on thought and thought on sound and sight. Then there is a depth of thought untouched by words, and deeper still a gulf of formless feelings untouched by thought. And I think I don't know, not point about that, but it just
Yeah. No, thank you. That's a really great passage to bring us to. Yeah, and I think so within Walker's excerpt, she's laying out that she's struggling with the grief of grieving Hurston, I think as a writer, person, thinker. She's horrified by how she was kind of forgotten about. She's in this field, her unmarked grave is being covered by weeds, and she's forgotten. And she's just reckoning with those difficult emotions, I think some of which are kind of difficult to put into words. And then I think that kind of connects to the passage you brought up, Nora, thinking about just what is said in the book about feelings and thoughts, and how that sometimes comes, interrupts language. And so these are kind of things I'm interested in my own work. And I think so that's partially also why I'm highlighting them. But I think also because this will kind of get more into Hurston's theories around folklore. Walker is intentionally in conversation with how Hurston is reckoning with language and what it can hold and perhaps what it can't. So with that being said, can move on. So the folk and folklore. So what comes to mind when you hear the word folklore? As a genre, as you can. Yeah, for sure. So stories, people creating them together. So there's kind of maybe sometimes a communal authorship. And yeah, sometimes things make sense. Sometimes they don't always, but that's for sure part of storytelling, yes. Yes, for sure. So stories that are culturally significant, specific and significant. Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes they're passed down through generations. And yes, yeah.
I think stories that might be made up to like help people get through hard times.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Or even stories meant to like teach morals. So I'll think of like Aesop's.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, that is a very helpful point as well. Yes, so all of those contributions are right on track, and I think useful to just kind of keep in the back of our minds, like even if and I think we'll probably get more into like reading experience and precept and maybe the last few minutes of class, but even if you're unfamiliar with kind of some of the Black Southern vernacular and dialect that's present in the text, specifically in the storytelling folklore that's kind of going on between the folks of Eatonville and elsewhere. I think we're all familiar with folktales in some ways, like we've likely been read one as a child and, have learned about fables and likely know about just kind of folktales from our respective cultures and families. And, oftentimes both lore, folk tales are passed down orally. And so I think that kind of that point, and kind of going back to the keyword of oral history traditions, is I think really just important to point out in terms of kind of thinking about, if we know that folk tales are often meant to be passed down through orally, through sounds and listening, thinking about what Hurston is doing in this text when she's giving us scenes of of Janie's neighbors, and talking on the porch of the store, talking what she coins as mule talk. So specifically, we can get into the mule more and probably in precept, but so that all the talk and kind of lore that is around this mule in the town. And then yeah, so that's one big example of kind of folk lore, folkness kind of happening in the text. And yeah, but I think that also kind of points to yeah.
Do you think like part of the reason she chose to write it is about what, but just because like certain people would understand it and other people didn't.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Do you want to, because that's a good key term you bring up, salvage anthropology.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain to the class for anyone who might not know? what it is?
That like just
Yes, yes, I think partially for sure. I mean, I think anthropology is a very complicated field. We can't get into all of it today. But and yes, oftentimes like anthropologists didn't look like Hurston. There oftentimes were white men who were going into communities that weren't their own, and like historically, kind of doing what kind of folks call this kind of armchair, anthropology. So I think salvage anthropology in my mind, it like has connections to that. So she's disconnected from that, like historically, I think white tradition of anthropology, because she is looking at a town that she's from. She's looking at people that she considers herself in community with, even though she is also extracting stories, things from them. So, there is still that kind of level of contention there. So like, yes, to answer your question, I think yes, in part, for sure. She, Hurston, in writing this, I think many would argue once this tradition, this Black Southern vernacular and dialects, particularly in the early 20th century, to be recorded, even if it's not very easy to do on paper, or if it's not, I should say, even if putting it on paper may make it inaccessible to more mainstream audiences, such as, a Miss Mason, her white Northern benefactor, or other kind of liberal Northern literary circles that Miss Mason is a part of, and even perhaps to non-white folks who just aren't from the South anymore, whose families have migrated up. And so there are tons of people, tons of groups that the dialect that she engages with and that she chooses to keep the dialogue in is inaccessible to. And that's partially why we provided the audiobook. And I think the audiobook is also just a really enjoyable listen. But yeah, I definitely think that yes, Hurston, that is a move that she's making to make sure that this Black Southern vernacular and dialect is maybe say archived in a sense, or just recorded and remembered for sure. Did I see a hand back here?
oh yeah. The recording process mostly technology next to that. I think to Los Angeles, you might not think it's too old.
Yeah.
The master. And I think in that sentence, she's trying to make some kind of statement about one type of historical source is not necessarily above or below another type of historical source. So like an oral history is not more or less valuable than a written history.
Yes, for sure. Sorry about that. Yes. Yeah, thank you for bringing our attention to this quote. So this, quote at the end of the slide comes from Hurston's essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression, which is published a few years before Their Eyes Are Watching God. And so she talks about a number of things in the essay, a number of elements of expression as it relates to Black life. And she's kind of making an argument for how Black folks, in her view, are expressing themselves, thinking, writing, engaging in oral history and whatnot. Another great essay that I recommend you take a look at. But so the part that I wanted to pull out from that essay, and it's in a section that she titles On Folklore, is what is here. Would someone mind reading this quote for me, please? Anyone? Yes. Thank you. So any more reflections on that quote? You can definitely kind of piggyback off of our first comment that was pertaining to it. And feel free to bring it to the text too, if you feel like there's just an example from the text that comes to mind when you read that quote, or just anything. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'll let us marinate with it a little more. I know I am kind of springing a few different outside sources on you, so no worries. We'll have more time to kind of unpack more in precept as well. But I think, let's see, I want to also, before we move on, just I think underscore talking about the concept of the new Negro and respectability politics. And this kind of brings us to critiques of Hurston's work, among her peers at the time who were kind of in these specifically Black literary circles. Like with any work, some people like it and some people don't, they don't get it, or they, and so I think to a succinct way to put it is that, so the new Negro, which is a term you may have heard, it's the name of now like books and anthologies like the one I have here. And that could be its own lecture, but it is a essay written by Alain Locke, and Locke is essentially Locke and other folks he's kind of in conversation with during this time, early 20th century, are so thinking like still situated around the time of the Harlem Renaissance and some time after. They're really preoccupied with the idea of moves that will uplift the race. And so you may have heard a term like this also from when folks like W.E.B. Du Bois come into the picture. It's a little earlier. But so yeah, this idea of racial uplift and using things like art and literature to as a way to uplift the race and to kind of make Black life and representations of it accessible and appealing to white audiences. And so it's kind of, that is one kind of school of thought. And so respectability politics, I think, is a later term that comes up later, folks looking back at that time and thinking like, okay, we see why folks may have felt the need to make that move, but also in the efforts to do that, in efforts to write, to a white audience, but as a Black writer trying to think about Black life and and efforts to maybe kind of scrub kind of just sanitize, I guess, narratives that might look like Hurston's to something that is not written in dialect, things get lost, and there it leans to a kind of respectability that can be erase a lot of folks. I think that kind of in the text comes up when with, I believe, kind of in critiques of Jody Stark's, Janie's second husband. He makes himself the mayor of Eatonville, and he has very strong views on what he thinks Janie as his wife and like the first lady of Eatonville should do and not do, and what is seen as respectable. And some of that is just kind of, views around gender and gender roles at the time. But he's also, saying he wants her to be seen as respectable and not common, I think is the word he uses. And so then other folks in the town are saying, well, like just because he might have a little more education than us, or they use the term like he's lettered, or some of us are unlettered, just pointing to formal education, doesn't mean like, they're pushing back up against like, he doesn't know more than we do, or that doesn't give him a right to talk down on us or talk down to us. So I think that could kind of be maybe a textual example of kind of trying to parse out the theme of respectability politics. Very big topic. Did I see a hand, Sabrina? Yeah.
Yeah, I just have a question.
Mhm.
Does that mean like, you're saying that people who advocated for respectability politics, or like these narratives were critical of works by Black authors that would like potentially portray Black characters in any kind of negative way? Like, is that, or like that to appeal to a white audience, and like to create or to further like this narrative, our like literature shouldn't have like any kind of negative narrative that could be like criticized by a white audience?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, like there are multiple different kind of stakeholders in this argument that I'm, like kind of potentially breezing over for the sake of time. But yeah, some people kind of associated with this kind of new Negro kind of movement or mindset feel that way. Yes, that literature, art, things that get put out, and this kind of points to folks like Du Bois too, and his arguments and things like the Souls of Black folks. They are always inherently political, and they're always kind of representational of the Black race, who different folks are trying to uplift post-slavery, kind of post-Reconstruction, during Reconstruction, as Jim Crow is looming, like all of those things. But a lot of folks feel that Hurston goes against that by saying like, I'm okay with including characters and centering characters whose dialogue isn't proper English, who they don't fit into those boxes. And some people liked it, some people did not, but Black and white. So that is a real part of like the history and legacy of the story. And so I think now's a good time to move on to thinking about Eatonville, both mainly as a place in the novel, even though it's also really fascinating that it is a real place as well, not very far from Orlando, Florida. So and that kind of brings us to the final keywords of that I'll get to in a second. But so quickly, what thoughts or things kind of stood out to you as you were reading the text and kind of getting to know more about the town of Eatonville and how it came to be, how it functioned, the people within it? Like, just throw out what kind of stood out to you.
They all knew each other.
Yes, very small town. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, that definitely I think points to um the second bullet point, which is yeah, Starks's leadership of the town is just very interesting in and of itself. And he is definitely emulating things he's seen from his master from when he was enslaved. And yeah, I think he sees himself as very forward thinking, and I think you could argue has good intentions in some of the things he's doing. But there's a point in the text, I marked it, but it's gotten lost amongst other things. But so yeah, I'm sorry I can't provide a page number, but there's a point where we're getting a description of the text in the text of the house that Jody is building for he and Janie. And it's this big white house that doesn't look like any of the other homes in the town. And so in addition to like his store being the center of the town and the place where folks kind of gather and talk, where this folk lore and folk tales are shared, this big white house is also very much so present and an important like thing to think about in terms of location. And I put plantation aesthetics and as a second bullet point because for me when reading it, I thought, okay, well, this reads as very the geography of Eatonville and the way Hurston is describing it is, yes, you have the store, which is a place where Starks and Janie are entrepreneurs. There's also this big white house that he's building that is meant to stand out and look different than the other homes in the area, and kind of contribute to his notoriety. And then just, paired with the way he talks to people and the way he moves, I think you could argue there's definitely a kind of plantation aesthetic going on, which is interesting to just think about. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily what was happening in all historically Black towns. There were other ones that were present in like just Reconstruction and early 20th century. Hurston looks at some of them as we saw in the chronology. But I just think it's interesting that Hurston highlights that in her description of Eatonville in the text. And so time is moving very quickly, so I will wrap things up by talking about I think the last point of the historical need for towns like Eatonville, because of course someone might ask the question of like, well, why did there need to be historically Black towns after slavery? Like, why couldn't everyone like live amongst each other? And I think we've had previous lectures where we've talked about race riots and kind of terror, white terror specifically, that's enacted on Black communities in 19th century going into the 20th century. And so that's the thing. Some of you may be familiar with the term sundown towns. Does anyone want to quickly throw out the definition of that? Or
Like if Black people were out past the sundown, it was really dangerous for them.
right. Yeah. So yeah, these are towns where they're segregated and Black folks were not allowed to be there after the sundown. They're oftentimes allowed to come in for domestic labor, and then they're expected to leave, and if not, there are violent consequences often. So that kind of contributes to, I think, why towns like Eatonville had to exist. And we even see that with when Tea Cake and Janie flee. They're not in Eatonville anymore. They flee, I guess, the part of the Everglades they're in when the storm comes, which we have to talk about in precept because that's a whole very big part of the book. And they encounter white people, and they realize you could read it as they might be in a sundown town. They realize they need to leave. Yeah, and I think the last point of I included Northern exceptionalism as a keyword. It's a term that I think different scholars have thrown around just to essentially kind of point out the fact that, so we've talked about this kind of great migration that is happening in late 19th century, early 20th century. And that these movements lead to things like the Harlem Renaissance and things happening in these northern metropolitan cities, specifically like cultural kind of expansions and explosions. And so a lot of the focus culturally is on what's happening in the New Yorks, the Chicago's, these great northern cities. And so a critique is kind of, well, if the focus is on folks moving up there, specifically Black folks finding and building community up in the North, what about the folks who stayed behind? You know, like what about the folks who are still in the South, maybe, and some of whom are definitely educated. But regardless of educational status, like where are the narratives about them? You know, that's definitely, I think, a ongoing kind of debate and question. And so I think Hurston definitely could argue pushes back up against some of that Northern exceptionalism by centering Eatonville, Florida, and other parts of Florida the way she does in this text. So that brings us to our time. Sadly, there's no time for our precept discussion, but the discussion will continue. I'm looking forward to precept conversation. I know Professor Barnes is too. So like I said, you will hear more information about the makeup for folks who are in her section. But yeah, thank you all for your attention. And I will see you here on Thursday at 11 a.m. More details to come on that, but yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.